everyone, Anarch here, and this is another episode of Anarch Abridged. Today's episode is going to be on the topic of why voting doesn't really matter. And I know a lot of you who are probably really fired up about the election this year are not happy about me saying that, but if you stick around, I will discuss the reason why I think that. And it's pretty obvious why I've chosen to do this video when I did it, right? I mean, it's an election year here in the United States, and every time we come around to election season, we end up having this really extended discourse about the use of voting, who we should vote for, what the lesser of two evils is, and so on. So what I'm hoping to do is create this one video where these arguments against the utility of voting can all sort of be compiled in one place. And obviously it's not going to be perfectly exhaustive, but what I'm hoping to do is kind of give an overview of the arguments about voting and why it is that so many radicals try to de-emphasize the discussions about electoralism and about voting for different candidates and about who we back. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, you should stick around because that is going to be the topic of this video. So I guess I should start by saying it's not necessarily that voting doesn't matter per se, it's that voting is sort of a distraction. I think that what happens when the voting season comes around is that people get really fixated on who they should vote for, what the reasoning as to why they're voting for some person or not voting for some person might be. And I think that what I'm trying to really emphasize here is that that is a distraction. And moreover, that it doesn't have a substantive effect on the political system that we're actually dealing with. And I know that might sound like kind of a controversial take for a lot of people. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lay out my reasoning as to why that's the case. I also want to emphasize that given that I'm saying voting doesn't really matter, then I'm also saying that not voting doesn't really matter, right? I'm saying that there's no real moral condemnation to be had in either direction. So that's to say, right up front, if you want to go vote, just do it. And it should be said, I don't think it really takes up a whole lot of energy to vote, right? I mean, most people spend maybe at most a few hours. I mean, we've all heard of the horror stories of people standing there for, many hours, almost all day, but we all know that that's kind of a rarity. Voting is usually a pretty low effort task, all things considered, and therefore the most that any person is really devoting to the act of voting itself is maybe an entire day. And with that being said, you might be wondering, well, what is the substance of this critique, right? Like, what is it I'm trying to say? Well, what I'm trying to say is that the system as structured in any representative democracy, voting for representatives has very little effect on how that system is going to function in the near future. The system has a series of mechanisms internal to itself, which maintain necessary functions and drive it toward these sort of predictable next outcomes. In order to explain what I mean by that, first I think we need to talk about what the reasoning for voting for representatives is in a representative democracy. Like, why do we structure it this way? What is the sort of philosophical, political argument as to why that having a representative democracy is a democracy in a sense? So the basic argument of a representative democracy is that when we vote for somebody, we are voting for somebody who represents our interests. It's even in the name, a representative. The idea is that if people get together and they're given a series of people to vote for, they're going to vote for the one that best matches their views on the topics at hand, the one who campaigns with their interests in mind. And the entire reasoning as to why we need that representative to quote unquote represent our interests is because not everybody can spend all of their time in the task of deliberation and formation of policy, and therefore what we need are people to be voted in to do these sort of administrative tasks, to devote their time and efforts to the development of policy, and then the discussion, amendment, and passage of that same policy within houses comprised of those representatives. You'll notice that at the very base of this is an assumption that the masses of people cannot make those decisions themselves, right? There's lots of ways that you might justify why that's the case. Some people will say that it's because people are just too stupid or imprudent or, unable to make sophisticated decisions. They don't have enough expertise. Some people will apply to more practical reasoning, which is to say that we just don't have time for it, or that it's a very specialized labor, and therefore these people have to devote all of their efforts. So then the argument is that these people are sort of carrying out our will in an indirect sense. When we vote for them, they are representatives of our conception of the world, and we as constituents are consenting to the decisions that they make on our behalf. However, the main problem is that this is really a mythology. In practice, these people don't represent our needs. They end up representing the needs of the powerful. And whatever system that is, whoever is powerful in that system, the representatives that end up in positions of power, they end up siding with the needs of power. They end up instead becoming representatives of those who are privileged within the power structure. And I mean that very broadly, because I don't only mean that in the context of, say, the United States. Okay? I mean that in all representative systems. So I also mean this, for example, in systems such as the USSR or China, where people also vote for representatives, or voted for in the past tense. But in all of these systems, the representatives ended up capitulating to the systems of power that they were embedded in. So let's inspect why that is the case. Because right off the bat, the central question is, why? Just thinking kind of naively about how this system works. The representatives are only able to continue doing their job insofar as they keep getting voted in, right? And we imagine that they are only going to get voted in insofar as they carry out the will of their constituents. If they don't carry out the will of their constituents, then surely they're just not going to get elected. So there seems to be some internal process for correction. The question is, why doesn't this process actually lead to representation in the purest sense, as the system supposes that it's supposed to be able to achieve? So I think it's really appealing, especially in the United States, to talk about procedural problems. And this is the way I kind of first came across this subject and began developing critiques on this subject. And what it really boiled down to is that in a system such as the United States, where you have a first past the post system, and you have what is called an electoral college, the votes of the people don't matter nearly as much, and the people are forced to hedge their bets and vote for the lesser of two evils. However, I don't want to get bogged down in that too much, because the truth is, those are not problems that many other representative democracies face who have a parliamentary system. So here in the United States, we may emphasize those problems more, but clearly those can't be the problems. Because if those were the problems, why does it also occur in every other representative democracy that we ever see? If the problem were just an electoral college and the first past the post system, which either says that you win or you don't win, then why is it that parliaments all over the earth that don't have electoral colleges, and in fact have long processes of negotiation of majorities, why is it that they also still exhibit these features? Why do they still end up in this process where the ruling class rules through the representatives that are supposed to represent their constituents? And there are a variety of reasons for that, but they're not immediately obvious. Sometimes they're kind of hard to understand because they seem very philosophical at first. One of the big reasons is because of the illusion of choice. Usually, the people that we are offered to vote for, the people who make it onto the ballot in any nation, are those who were already kind of well off, that already had some kind of platform or another. They don't generally come from modest beginnings. Even though in the foundations of representative democracy, this is what's supposed to happen. People are supposed to produce representatives from their communities, sort of organic leadership that occurs in their communities, and those are supposed to become their representatives. That's the ideal we conceive is supposed to happen in a representative system. However, in reality, I think we all recognize that what really happens is that those who are wealthy, that have some privilege of fame beforehand, that are already embedded in the system in one way or another, they are able to get elected much more easily, even if they maybe don't really represent the needs or desires of that constituency. So what that means is we create a system which tends to benefit those who already have some starting advantage, the wealthy or the famous or the charismatic in some sense or another. So a lot of people, once again, including myself just a few years ago, would have said the solution to this problem is campaign finance reform. So yeah, wealthy people are succeeding in that sense because they have so much money to spend right off the bat, right? They have all these connections, and therefore those connections get them a bunch of money they can then spend on their campaigns in order to be elected. However, once again, this runs up against a problem. This is a very America-centric view of the issue, because elsewhere, there are systems in place which sort of equalize that playing field, both through capping the amount that can be spent on these campaigns, but also a lot of nations actually have systems where if you are approved to be put on the ballot to possibly be elected, they give you some stipend of funds. And, that stipend of funds is tax funded, and everybody has to run on that same amount. And so you might imagine, okay, that's going to equalize the playing field. Poor people could get in there and they could run and become representatives, and that should fix the problem, right? The problem is that even in those nations, they have all the same problems. So what this indicates is that these procedural problems that we've discussed, these aren't the problems, okay? The problem is not first past the post voting. The problem is not the electoral college. The problem is not campaign finance reform, even though obviously if you could correct those things, it would probably help somewhat. But given that those things have already been fixed in other places, clearly they cannot be the root of the problem. There must be something else at play here. And what I would like to do in this video is discuss what's really taking place. So one of the problems is that those who already have any sort of fame or privilege or in any way are sort of charismatic, they have a head start in the system. And that causes a sort of problem. It's funny because the Greeks thought that the problem with direct democracy was demagogues. That is to say, very charismatic people who'd go around and convince large groups of people to follow them down very foolish avenues. However, what we see is that in a representative system, this is actually endemic. The demagogue takes control in a huge number of different circumstances. And this is partially because those who are charismatic, those who already have some form of fame, are already ahead of the pack against all of those they are running against. They already have infrastructures to gain attention. They already have media training. They've already been on news programs. They know how to interact with power. They know how to make arguments that are going to persuade large groups of people. What this means is that those who do not come from a position of privilege in one sense or another are always going to be kind of behind those who have some form of privilege, either wealth or charisma or fame in one sense or another. Those people are always going to be at the head of the pack. And so that creates an inherent biasing privilege for the rich and the powerful. However, I don't want to overemphasize that fact because I think it might deceive people if we overemphasize that fact. That seems to make it out that if what you did was got these poor people, these marginalized people into positions of power, that they would be able to make a difference, right? What we have to do is we just have to find some way to get them media training, to get them media support where people can see them, where they attain some level of fame, and then they will fix the problems. Those people will be the true representative of their constituents. However, what I'd like to point out is that that's just also false. Insurgent candidates can succeed in the system. That is to say, they can be elected, and they can even form significant voting blocks with only a few of them, which allow them to have some leverage in the system. However, there are internal pressures inside of the system as well. And these internal pressures ultimately end up being the reason why even insurgent candidates really can't get much done. This is because of a variety of reasons, but one of those is that the majority, those with positions of privilege, either economic privilege, racial privilege, gender privilege, whatever it might be, they're already in a position of majority power in nearly every government on Earth. So what this means is when these insurgent candidates that are not from one of these majority privileged positions enter the power structure, they're going to be countervailed by a bunch of selecting pressures, which force them to do otherwise than what they might want to do. And if they try to buck these pressures, they don't end up being these sort of heroic figures that overturn the system as it is. They just end up themselves being marginalized and disempowered. And it should be said, this is a deselecting pressure in a representative democracy. If your representative doesn't get anything done, you're less likely to vote for them again. And so what that means is internally, all the other people within your representative system have to do is they just have to make that person unsuccessful. They just have to neuter that person from the avenues of power that they might want to use in order to enact their constituents' desires. So what this means is systems have a sort of inertia towards the majority privileged positions of the society that they are embedded within. The state is ultimately a kind of machine which is built to monopolize power for those who are already in privileged positions within society. It not only acts to entrench existing hierarchies, but it acts to entrench hierarchies in general, because those who are in positions of privilege within those hierarchies are already going to have some form of leverage in society, which allows them to enter those positions of representative leadership more easily. And then it allows them to countervail those who might want to undermine those positions of hierarchical privilege. So what this really means is that representative democracy really acts to entrench the hierarchical power structures that exist in society, and in a practical sense, exists to make sure that they continue being perpetuated. For every decision that somebody can make once they are in a position of representative leadership, there's a sort of push and pull of power. There's incentives and disincentives. And what this means is once you are in this position of representative power, you're sort of being conditioned and reconditioned by the system. The system ultimately becomes like a Skinner box, which doles out rewards and punishments based on how you abide by the system's needs and drives. Here, there's a really common objection, however. People tend to point out that yeah, maybe all that's true. However, clearly the institution itself is not some completely immovable fixture. It's not a monolith. It has some kind of wiggle room, right? It does make some difference who is elected into these positions of representative power. And of course, what they do is they appeal to the presidencies or the terms of different representatives within their contexts where they did better or worse than previous people who were in those positions. And I just want to concede that, yes, of course it's the case that there is some amount of wiggle room. However, I think the point that I'm trying to get across here is that there's only a certain amount of wiggle. And the amount of wiggle is determined by the system itself. The system has its own internal needs and drives. And these internal needs and drives determine the range of possible different orientations one can have within the system. It's almost like there's a sort of center of gravity to the system, and everybody is being pushed and pulled into following that center of gravity. Those who don't are going to be punished by the system. And those who give in to that center of gravity are generally going to be pushed into positions of power. It's important to understand that it's neither that the system has some sort of consciousness, nor that each of those within the elected positions drive the machine, per se. It's instead that the system has certain conditions for self-perpetuation, that if they are not met, those who refuse to meet those conditions will be confronted with opposing stimuli. Either they will meet those conditions and they will be rewarded, or they will defy those conditions and they will be punished. This is why, even though we've been voting for different candidates, helping different parties gain majorities, helping insurgent electoral candidates end up in positions of representative leadership, we are still backsliding into fascism across the planet. Why would that be if our votes made so much difference? Ultimately, it's because there are paths of least resistance through the system, and those paths of least resistance are determined by existing hierarchies, whether it be the hierarchy of white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy, or otherwise. But I hear you say, what about FDR? What about the Scandinavian social democracies? Don't these demonstrate that you can conduct insurgent electoral campaigns? The simple answer is no, they don't. Actually, all of these examples, they corresponded with the existence of a radical bottom-up movement that had already transformed so many social conditions that voting for progressive candidates was a sort of bygone conclusion. So let's take FDR, for example, because a lot of people point to him. FDR was elected after around 30 to 40 years, maybe even more, of radical labor action, which had established unions all over the nation, which had given a lot of people collective bargaining power that they just did not have beforehand. And they had confederated a lot of these unions into bigger and bigger power structures, such that these union power structures were very formidable forces within the societies that they had arisen inside, to the degree where if you're in one of these big unions and they are clearly fighting for your livelihood, when the time comes, when you go to the ballot box, it's obvious that you're going to vote for a progressive candidate that wants to expand the power of unions. It didn't go the other way around. It didn't take place by way of people just saying that we should vote for progressive candidates, and then all at once unions boomed and we had a huge successful movement of social democracy within the government. It was the other way around. The movement had to be built before we could actually even get any of those electoral successes. But you may be saying, what about the Scandinavian social democracies? Don't they all seem like they're examples of the success of electoralism? And the answer is no. Actually, all of them had the exact same conditions taking place, and pretty well within the same time period. In the early 1900s, there were many revolutionary movements that were demanding a complete transformation of society. And Scandinavia was no different in this sense. What they had was a revolutionary social movement that was so pervasive that electoral campaigns were bygone conclusions, much like what we just discussed with FDR and the progressive era here in the United States. However, in all of the examples we've given, once we ended up succeeding in these electoral campaigns and we ended up putting social democrats into positions of considerable power, they passed all kinds of great social programs. They promoted the creation of unions and generally did lead to a better version of capitalism. Ultimately, all of these have backslid into the conditions they are in today. And this is largely because once they got into positions of considerable power, they ended up sort of suppressing these revolutionary movements that had made them happen to begin with. Once people thought that their needs could be met through the state and simple electoral campaigns, there was a process of de-radicalization that took place. The bottom-up movements which had led to these social democratic successes now felt as if they no longer had a constituency or no longer had a place, and so they slowly faded away. And in the occasion of the United States, it should be said, they were destroyed quite directly by two Red Scares, one in the 19 teens and then one closer to the time of FDR. Now what we're left with is societies who once had a social democratic period, but no longer have a revolutionary movement and are quickly declining into conditions of fascism. Even though Scandinavian social democracies are starting to have insurgent fascist parties, which are radically altering the conditions of their societies. So then, does that mean we shouldn't vote? No, it doesn't matter. That's the point. If it makes you feel better to go vote, then go vote. And if you don't care, then don't. The point I'm trying to get across is that if you actually want the transformation of conditions, even if your goal is social democracy, the key is actually not in insurgent electoral campaigns. It is in creating a revolutionary constituency that demands more than the system can handle, such that you begin to transform social conditions, and people, when they go to the ballot box, there's no persuading needed. Voting for progressive candidates is a bygone conclusion. That's the least of their worries, because people are engaged in something that is so much bigger than the electoral system itself. And I'll offer a caveat. If there are ballot initiatives that you think are important, then you should probably go vote for them. Ballot initiatives are one of the few directly democratic means that we actually have in this society. So go vote for things that you think will be positive changes in that sense. The key takeaway isn't if you vote, you're doing something wrong. It's that it's a distraction. It's just not the thing you should be focusing your attention on. And every time one of these election seasons comes around, it gets us so distracted with the election itself that we stop talking about the things that are actually important. We stop talking about how to actually build a movement. And people get caught up in the arguments between the lesser of two evils. Because here's the fact of the matter. We are not going to stop fascism by voting. What we actually have to do is we have to build a bottom-up movement that demands more than the system can conceivably give us. That is to say, we have to create a revolutionary constituency that actually creates power for the masses, such that when the time comes that the power structure is trying to decide what it should do based on incentives and disincentives, it has to take into account the risk that it may be completely overthrown and replaced with a different system. Even if all you want is social democracy, even if all you want is to elect better people into positions of power, you're actually better off supporting revolutionary campaigns from the bottom up. We have to build power that is so much of a threat to prevailing power structures that the least they could do is concede the elections of our progressive candidates. If there is a revolutionary bottom-up campaign that sweeps through a nation, people are just going to vote for those progressive candidates. The only way that movements make any difference in the world is if they have maximal demands that are more than the system can possibly handle. You have to come to the table demanding the whole loaf of bread. You can't start by begging for breadcrumbs, and ultimately trying to elect progressive candidates is begging for breadcrumbs. We have to demand the whole system be within the power of the masses of people. And hopefully, if the system resists, we can bring about a revolutionary juncture wherein we put a different kind of society in place. But if we fall short of that, at least if we aimed for something much greater than we could possibly achieve, we achieved far more than we would have otherwise. You don't come to the table with your enemy negotiating for your minimum demand. You start the negotiation with your maximal demand. So the only path forward, whether you are a reformist or a revolutionary, is revolution. That is to say, All of our efforts should be put into developing an alternative power structure that is a true threat to the system as it stands. And anything less isn't going to achieve much. In fact, it's probably just going to help the fascists succeed. Anyway, I hope that was informative for you. That's about all I have to say on the matter at the moment. If you liked the video, you should go click like. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, you should click subscribe. And if you appreciate the work that I'm doing here, you should go become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/anarch. Here over the last month or two, I've actually had a drop in patrons, so that's been a little bit discouraging. However, if you want to help boost that back up, you can just go over to that Patreon and become a patron for any amount, $2, $5, $7, $10, or $20. Any of those amounts are available on my Patreon. And I should add, if you become a patron, you get access to the Anarch Discord server, where we are always having conversations about current events and theory and discussion of praxis. It is a really cool collection of people who are anarchists and libertarian socialists, and it also acts as a vector for you to be able to speak to me more directly, as I interact with the Discord server quite a bit more than I interact anywhere else. So that's it for the pitch. I won't bore you anymore. I appreciate you watching the video, and I'll see y'all next time.